Let's get one thing straight. There's a moment that happens to almost everyone when they first hear real medieval history. A detail gets mentioned, something extreme, unsettling, or deeply uncomfortable, and your brain immediately pushes back. That can't be right. That has to be exaggerated. Someone made that up to make the past look worse than it really was. Because surely, no society could function like that, and yet it did. The Middle Ages don't feel unreal because historians embellished them. They feel unreal because modern life has removed us from constant risk. We don't live surrounded by animals. We don't smell decay daily. We don't expect illness to be fatal. We don't grow up watching death unfold in public. Medieval people did. And when you strip away the myths about medieval life, what you're left with isn't ignorance, it's endurance. Tonight, we're not debunking fairy tales. We're uncovering the medieval myths that sound fake because they were true. And by the end, you'll understand why medieval people didn't think their world was shocking at all. They thought it was normal. If you enjoy slow, honest history like this, stories that don't rush or sanitize the past, you may want to stay connected. A like or a subscription quietly helps this channel grow and keeps this kind of storytelling alive. Now, let's step into a world where safety was never assumed. One of the biggest mistakes we make when imagining medieval life is assuming people ever fell off duty. They didn't. There was no safe baseline, no stable background hum of security, no invisible systems working quietly to keep life predictable. Everything required attention. Water had to be watched, food had to be protected, fire had to be controlled, disease had to be feared, authority had to be obeyed or challenged. Even sleep wasn't guaranteed to be restful. A knock at the door could mean a tax collector, a cough could mean death, a bad harvest could mean starvation. Life didn't come with buffers, and that context matters because it explains why so many medieval realities feel exaggerated to us now. They weren't living in a dirty or violent era. They were living in an era where nothing insulated them from consequence. Which leads us directly into one of the most persistent myths of all. Myth number 1, medieval people were filthy because they didn't care. This is the easiest myth to believe. It's clean, convenient, a moral judgment disguised as history. The idea that medieval people were dirty because they were ignorant, lazy, or indifferent. But medieval people cared about cleanliness deeply, sometimes obsessively. They washed their hands before meals, they laundered clothes regularly, they combed their hair, they bathed when water allowed. Public bathhouses existed in many cities, not hidden, not shameful, popular. Some bathhouses even became social spaces, places to talk, gossip, relax. So where does the image of universal filth come from? The answer isn't behavior, it's environment. Imagine bathing thoroughly, then stepping into a street filled with animals, refuse, and mud. Imagine clean water being shared by every household upstream. Imagine wearing freshly washed clothes while walking through a city that produces tons of waste every single day with no modern disposal system. Cleanliness was temporary, not because people didn't care, but because the world undid their efforts constantly. Even the wealthiest households struggled to stay clean. And when cleanliness fails at the city level, the consequences don't stay cosmetic. They become biological. Which brings us to a myth that's usually laughed off as crude exaggeration. Myth number 2. People just use the streets as toilets. This one sounds like an insult, not a historical claim. Surely medieval people weren't dumping waste into the streets, except... Sometimes they were. Most homes didn't have toilets in the modern sense. Instead, they relied on chamber pots and privies connected to cesspits, deep holes dug beneath homes, courtyards, or alleyways. These pits filled up, and when they did, someone had to empty them. There was no sewage truck, no instant removal. Emptying a cesspit took hours, sometimes days, and until that happened, waste had to go somewhere. Cities tried to regulate this. Some laws required dumping only at night. Others demanded verbal warnings before anything was thrown from a window. These weren't jokes, they were survival protocols. Because waste wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Overflowing cesspits contaminated groundwater. They weakened foundations. They created breeding grounds for disease. So cities employed professionals to deal with the worst of it. Men known as gong farmers. They worked only at night. They climbed into cesspits by hand. They hauled waste bucket by bucket. It was one of the most essential jobs in medieval society, and one of the most despised. Some died from collapsing pits, others from toxic fumes. This wasn't medieval chaos, it was medieval sanitation. And it shaped how people understood sickness itself. When disease followed filth, medieval people noticed. They didn't have microscopes, they didn't understand bacteria, but they did understand patterns. Where rot gathered, sickness followed. Where air smelled foul, death increased. So they formed a theory, and it shaped medicine, law, religion, and fear itself. In the next section, we'll explore how medieval people believed illness spread, and why their explanation wasn't nearly as foolish as we assume. Imagine walking through a city where every smell feels like a warning. Where the air isn't neutral, but suspicious. Where breathing feels like exposure. That was medieval urban life, and the theory they built to explain it would dominate European medicine for centuries. Act 2. The fear you couldn't see. To understand medieval fear, you have to stop thinking about danger as something visible. The greatest threat wasn't a sword, or a thief, or even an invading army. It was the air, because air was everywhere. It entered your lungs, it lingered in rooms, it pooled in alleyways and cellars. And when people got sick, the air was always there when it happened. Medieval cities smelled alive, not just unpleasant, active, warm rot, stagnant moisture, animal waste breaking down in the heat, smoke hanging low between buildings that blocked the wind. You didn't just walk through a bad smell, you breathed it. And people noticed something terrifying. Where the air was worst, death followed. Myth number 3. Medieval. People thought disease was random or supernatural. It's tempting to assume medieval people blamed sickness on demons, curses, or divine punishment alone. But most of the time, they blamed something far more practical. Bad air. The theory was called miasma, the belief that disease spread through poisonous vapors rising from decay. Rotting waste, stagnant water, open graves, spoiled food. All of it released invisible danger. And in their world, that explanation made sense because when neighborhoods smelled worse, more people died. When rivers became clogged with waste, illness followed downstream. When summer heat intensified decay, death rates rose. So medieval people responded the only way they could. They tried to control the air. The measures that sound strange, but worked. Cities passed laws regulating where waste could be dumped. Butchers were restricted from slaughtering animals near residential areas. Tanneries were pushed to the outskirts of towns. People burned herbs, carried fragrant bundles, hung flowers inside homes. The wealthy wore pomanders, small decorative containers filled with spices and perfumes to shield themselves from foul air. This wasn't fashion, it was protection. If you could overpower the bad air, you believed you could protect your body. And sometimes, these measures actually helped. Not because they killed bacteria, but because they reduced exposure to filth. Ironically, medieval people were sometimes right for the wrong reasons, and nothing motivated action more than royal discomfort. When kings complained, cities moved. Medieval kings tolerated many things. Bad smells were not one of them. When royalty planned to visit a city, preparations weren't ceremonial, they were hygienic. Streets were cleared, waste was removed, animals were driven out, rivers were dredged. In 1332, King Edward III complained that York smelled worse than any place he had ever visited. He demanded immediate action. And it worked. The city cleaned itself, not permanently, but enough. These moments tell us something important. Medieval people knew their cities were dangerous, they just lacked the tools to fix them permanently. But danger wasn't limited to disease. It extended to how justice itself was carried out. Myth number 4, medieval justice was randomly cruel. Public executions haunt modern imagination. Beheadings, hangings, mutilations. It's easy to assume medieval punishment was uniquely sadistic. But medieval justice wasn't about cruelty, it was about visibility. There were no prisons as we know them, no long-term incarceration. Punishment had to be immediate, memorable, and public. Executions weren't hidden, they were lessons. Yeah. People gathered not because they enjoyed it, but because this was how society enforced order. And most crimes didn't lead to death. Many ended in fines, public humiliation, or exile. Violence stands out because it wasn't concealed. Death wasn't removed from daily life, which brings us to a myth that feels especially uncomfortable. Myth number 5, medieval people were numb to death. With so much mortality, it's easy to think people stopped caring. But medieval grief was intense. Funerals were communal. Bells rang constantly. Entire towns paused when someone died. Parents mourned children. Spouses mourned partners. Communities mourned neighbors. Death wasn't ignored. It was acknowledged, constantly. Art filled with skulls wasn't morbid. It was honest. Medieval people lived with death, not because they were indifferent, but because it was unavoidable. And that constant presence shaped how people thought about life itself, especially childhood. Quick pause. Which of these realities surprised you the most so far? The fear of air, the visibility of justice, or how deeply people mourned? Drop a comment below, it helps shape what stories we explore next. Now, let's talk about the part of medieval life most people misunderstand completely. Children. To modern eyes, medieval childhood looks cruel. But cruelty isn't the right word. Vulnerability is. And it shaped everything. Act 3. Childhood without illusions. Modern childhood is built around protection. Protected time, protected spaces, protected innocence. Medieval childhood wasn't. And not because parents didn't care, but because survival didn't allow for delay. Children in the Middle Ages learned very early that the world was fragile. They saw illness firsthand, they watched siblings die, they heard church bells ring constantly. This wasn't trauma in the modern psychological sense, it was context. Childhood wasn't designed to shelter you from reality, it was designed to prepare you for it. Which leads to one of the most emotionally charged myths we tell ourselves. Myth number 6, medieval parents didn't love their children. This myth persists because medieval parents behaved differently. They didn't hover, they didn't coddle, they didn't postpone responsibility. But medieval letters, wills, church records, and personal prayers tell a different story. Parents mourned deeply. They commissioned masses for deceased children. They named children after lost siblings. They loved fiercely. But infant mortality was brutal. In some regions, up to half of all children died before age 5. And repeated loss changes how people cope. Parents learned not to emotionally invest in futures that might never arrive. Not because they were cold, but because grief without restraint could destroy you. So love became quieter, practical, focused on survival. Children worked early, not because parents didn't care, but because contribution meant protection. A child who could help was a child with value to the household. And value meant survival. By the age of 7, many children were already working, not in factories but in homes, fields, workshops. They fetched water, watched animals, carried tools, ran errands. This wasn't punishment, it was training. Apprenticeships often began in early adolescence. Children were sent to live with craftsmen, learning trades that would feed them for life. Education didn't look like classrooms. It looked like repetition, observation, and failure. Mistakes weren't abstract. They had consequences, and those lessons stuck. Which is why medieval people matured quickly, not emotionally numb, but practically sharp. And yet this hard upbringing coexisted with joy. Games, songs, toys carved from wood or bone. Medieval childhood wasn't joyless, it was compressed, and compressed lives shaped how people understood the body itself. Myth number 7, medieval medicine was just guesswork. This myth sounds generous. that medieval doctors were simply guessing in the dark. But medieval medicine was systematic, sometimes frighteningly so. Doctors didn't view the body as mechanical. They saw it as a balance of forces: hot and cold, wet and dry, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Illness wasn't invasion, it was imbalance, so treatment meant correction. Bloodletting wasn't random, it was precise. The location, amount, and timing were carefully chosen. Purging wasn't cruelty, it was cleansing. Doctors examined urine color, asked about dreams, measured pulses. They believed deeply in what they were doing, and sometimes it worked. Not because the theory was correct, but because bodies are resilient. But when it failed catastrophically, especially during outbreaks. Imagine being a physician during an epidemic. Patients arrive daily, feverish, panicked, weak. You apply the tools you know: bloodletting, herbs, isolation. Some survive, many don't. But you don't abandon the system because it's all you have. This wasn't ignorance, it was conviction. And conviction gave medieval people certainty in a world that offered very little of it. Which brings us to another deeply misunderstood belief: that medieval people accepted their place in society without question. Myth number 8. Medieval society was static and unquestioned. The myth says everyone knew their place and stayed there. Reality was far messier. Peasants sued landlords, merchants rose to power, nobles fell into debt. Social mobility existed, but it was dangerous. Ambition could elevate you. It could also get you killed. And resentment simmered constantly. Tax records, petitions, revolts, they fill medieval archives. People complained, they protested, they rebelled. The peasants' revolt of 1381 wasn't sudden madness, it was pressure finally breaking. Medieval people weren't obedient by nature, they were constrained by force. And constraint breeds resistance. Which leads us to the most haunting myth of all. We often assume that because death was common, it meant life was cheap. But that assumption couldn't be more wrong. Myth number 9. Medieval people didn't value life. Life was precious because it was fragile. People prayed constantly, not out of superstition, but desperation. They commissioned art to preserve memory. They wrote wills early. They planned funerals long before death arrived. Every illness carried risk. Every winter carried fear. People didn't ignore death. They negotiated with it daily. And the awareness of mortality shaped humor, religion, and resilience. Medieval laughter was often dark. Not because people were cruel, but because humor was armor. Which brings us to the final act, the myth that medieval people didn't know how brutal their world really was. Were medieval people blind to their suffering? Or did they see it more clearly than we do now? That answer closes everything. Act 4, awareness without escape. There's one final myth that quietly underpins all the others. The belief that medieval people simply didn't know how harsh their lives were. That they lacked perspective. That suffering felt normal because they'd never experienced anything better. That they couldn't imagine an alternative. But medieval people were not naive. They were painfully aware. They wrote about exhaustion. They complained about filth. They mocked authority. They joked about death. Medieval sermons warned about the dangers of cities. Poets wrote about the cruelty of fortune. Satirical illustrations depicted doctors as fools, priests as corrupt, nobles as parasites. This wasn't ignorance, it was clarity without control. They could see the cracks in their world, but they didn't have the tools to fix them, and that awareness shaped medieval culture in ways that feel startlingly modern. Myth number 10. Medieval people didn't question their world. If medieval people blindly accepted their reality, their art wouldn't look the way it does. Manuscripts are filled with marginal drawings, mocking kings, priests, and even God. Legal records show citizens suing lords, students rioting against universities, towns resisting royal authority. Complaints were everywhere, about taxes, about corruption, about injustice. Medieval people didn't assume life was fair. They assumed it was difficult, and that assumption shaped a worldview grounded in endurance rather than optimism. Which is why humor mattered so much. Medieval jokes were often grim, skeletons dancing, death personified, plagues turned into morality plays. To modern audiences, this can feel disturbing. But humor wasn't denial, it was defiance. Laughing at death was a way of shrinking it, of reclaiming control in a world where control was scarce. This wasn't nihilism, it was resilience, and it extended into how medieval people thought about faith itself. Myth number 11. Religion made medieval people passive. Religion didn't make medieval people passive, it made them pragmatic. Faith offered structure in chaos, meaning in loss, explanation in uncertainty. People prayed not because they expected miracles, but because prayer gave form to fear. Religious rituals created rhythm in unpredictable lives. Feast days, fast days, bells marking time. This wasn't blind obedience, it was psychological survival. And even religion wasn't beyond critique. Church corruption was openly criticized. Clergy were mocked in literature. Reform movements rose repeatedly. Medieval belief wasn't static, it was negotiated daily. Which brings us to the final and most important truth. The myth behind all myths. The biggest myth about medieval life isn't about filth, violence, or ignorance. It's the belief that medieval people were fundamentally different from us. They weren't. They wanted safety, they wanted stability, they wanted comfort, they wanted meaning. They adapted to a world that offered very little of those things. And when we call their reality exaggerated or unreal, what we're really reacting to is proximity. Their lives were closer to risk, closer to death, closer to consequence. Modern life didn't make us wiser, it made us buffered. Understanding medieval myths that were actually real isn't about shock value. It's about perspective. It reminds us that progress isn't guaranteed, that safety is constructed, that comfort is recent. The medieval world wasn't a nightmare people slept through. It was a system people endured, questioned, mocked, and survived. They built families, they told stories, they laughed, they loved. Not because life was kind, but because giving up wasn't an option. And that endurance is what connects us to them. If this reframed how you think about the Middle Ages, a like helps more than you realize. It tells YouTube that thoughtful history still matters. And if you want more stories that strip away the myths and let the past speak honestly, subscribing keeps you connected. History isn't distant, it's human. The Middle Ages don't feel unreal because they were extreme. They feel unreal because we've forgotten what living without a safety net looks like.